What if the biggest danger in this war was never the missiles at all? What if the real damage started the moment a country's own bridges, its own power lines, its own ports began to fail? If you want the full picture of what's happening right now, and not just the soundbite version, hit that like button before you scroll away, subscribe so you don't miss the next update, and send this to one person who still thinks this war is only about missiles. Because it stopped being that a while ago, and almost nobody noticed the moment it happened. Let's go back to how this war actually started, because understanding the beginning helps you understand why the current phase feels so different. For months, the pattern was almost predictable. Iran would make a move near the Strait of Hormuz. The United States would respond by hitting military targets, radar stations, naval assets. Then things would settle for a while, until the next spark. It looked chaotic on the surface, but underneath there was a rhythm. Strike, response, pause. Almost like both sides understood an unspoken line they weren't ready to cross yet. Then something changed, not louder, not flashier, but far more serious. Reports began coming out of southern Iran describing American strikes on bridges across Hormozgan province. These weren't small local crossings. Some were major routes, still under construction, built to handle heavy traffic and heavy cargo. Officials confirmed that several had been damaged or destroyed. Near Bandar Abbas, one of Iran's busiest ports, a railway junction that connected freight lines to the rest of the country was hit, and the port itself, which had a deepwater section allowing ships to reach open ocean without passing, through the Strait of Hormuz, lost its control tower entirely. Stop and think about what that actually means. This wasn't a single lucky strike. This wasn't collateral damage from a nearby target. This was a series of coordinated hits on the physical systems that keep a country connected to itself. Roads, railways, ports, the things that let food move, fuel move, people move, supplies move. When you damage enough of that at once, you're not just hurting an army anymore. You're slowing down an entire nation's ability to function. And the damage didn't stop with transportation. A water pumping station near Bandar Abbas was reportedly hit. Power lines supplying the surrounding region went dark. Local reports described stalled freight movement, disrupted shipping, and a strained electrical grid. Iran's own energy ministry, in the middle of summer heat, asked citizens to cut back on electricity use. Read that again. A government, in the middle of a war it's fighting, asking its own people to turn down their air conditioning because the grid can't keep up. That is not a symbol of strength. That is the sound of a system being pushed toward its limit. The pressure didn't stay inside Iran's borders either. During retaliatory strikes, one of Kuwait's power and desalination facilities was damaged. That matters more than it might sound, because millions of people across the Gulf depend on desalination plants just to have clean drinking water. A lot of these facilities sit well within range of the weapons already in play. One miscalculation, one strike on the wrong target, and the consequences could spread across borders that had nothing to do with why this war started in the first place. So here's the real question worth asking. Why would any military planner deliberately shift from hitting missiles and radar systems to hitting bridges and power plants? What does that shift actually tell us? In the early stage of any war, militaries usually go after what's dangerous right now. A missile that could launch today, a radar system tracking planes in real time, a ship that could strike a tanker tomorrow. These are urgent threats, and you hit them because waiting is risky. Infrastructure works completely differently. A bridge isn't a threat sitting there waiting to fire at you. A power line isn't moving toward your position. These are the foundations everything else is built on. Going after the foundation isn't about winning this week. It's about deciding whether the other side can keep functioning next month or rebuilding next year. This kind of shift almost never happens at the start of a war. It shows up later, once enough intelligence has been gathered to know which bridge is actually a critical choke point, not just which one looks important from above. That kind of knowledge doesn't come from a single satellite photo. It comes from months of studying how a country actually moves its supplies, where the real bottlenecks are, which routes feed military production, and which ones just serve daily civilian life. The precision in these recent strikes, hitting exact junctions, exact port control systems, exact bridges tied to supply routes, tells you the planning for this didn't start last week. It started long before the first missile. Of this new phase was even launched. This was a plan waiting for the right moment to switch on. And this is where the story gets genuinely complicated, in a way that matters for how you understand everything that follows. American officials made direct public statements warning that Iranian power plants and bridges would be targeted if Iran didn't open the Strait of Hormuz by a certain point. The warnings weren't vague, they were specific. In response, Iranian leadership called on volunteers to form human chains around power stations, a symbolic message that said, ordinary citizens will stand here before these facilities fall. Iran's government claimed huge numbers answered that call. Meanwhile, France's foreign minister publicly warned that deliberately targeting civilian infrastructure crosses a line under international law and urged both sides to pull back. This is the tension sitting at the center of everything. One side argues these targets are legitimate because they're directly tied to how Iran supplies its military and keeps its state running. The other side argues that bridges, power lines, and water systems cross into civilian life in ways international law is meant to protect. Both arguments carry real weight. That's exactly what makes this moment so hard to simplify into a clean headline. If you're still with me, you clearly want the full picture, not just the loudest version. Tell me in the comments what part of this still feels unclear to you. I read through these, and it genuinely shapes what gets covered next. Now, let's talk about why Iran's infrastructure specifically became such a vulnerable point in this war. On the surface, it might not be obvious, but Iran has spent years under heavy international sanctions. Its access to normal banking, shipping insurance, and outside investment has been restricted for a long time. When the official channels get cut off, the physical routes, the roads, the rails, the ports become some of the only ways a country can still move goods and resources without every transaction being tracked and blocked. A rail line running north toward Central Asia isn't just a train track, it's an economic lifeline, one of the last paths Iran has to trade with countries further east without relying on contested sea routes that everyone else is watching closely. A southern port with deep-water access that avoids the Strait of Hormuz entirely isn't just a shipping dock either, it's an escape route. It's Iran's last relatively unmonitored connection to the wider world's shipping lanes. When strikes hit both of these at once, the southern port and the northern rail corridor, you're not watching random targets get picked off a list. You're watching two of Iran's most important backup routes get squeezed at the same time. That's not chance. That's a strategy built to slowly close off every alternative path, so that if the strait itself becomes unusable, there's nowhere left to turn. And then there's the deep water port's control tower, the structure that coordinated ships moving in and out of that harbor. Once that's gone, ships can't be guided safely anymore. Coordination breaks down. Every vessel trying to use that port becomes harder to track, harder to protect. The route doesn't fully close, but it stops working the way it's supposed to. Here's something that deserves direct attention because it's easy to lose inside all this strategy talk. People have died in these strikes. Iranian authorities have reported deaths and injuries from bridge strikes in Hormozgan province. Railway strikes near major cities have reportedly killed civilians who happened to be there at the wrong moment. One strike on a major bridge outside Tehran, one of the tallest structures in the region, reportedly killed people with injuries beyond that. Some of those killed were ordinary residents, families, workers, people living their normal lives directly beneath a structure now caught in a strategic decision made far from where they stood. This isn't just a chess piece on a map, it's real. You can understand the military reasoning behind a target and still hold onto the fact that every one of these strikes carries a human cost that doesn't disappear once the news cycle moves on. Both of those things can be true at the same time, and honestly, they should be. So why would any military leadership deliberately choose this kind of target, knowing the political and human cost attached to it? Because the message isn't really aimed at soldiers. It's aimed at the people making decisions inside a government, the ones who have to worry about whether the economy keeps running, whether the lights stay on, whether the public keeps its patience. A destroyed missile stockpile can often be rebuilt quickly if the money and materials exist. A bridge takes months. A rail line takes months. A power plant can take much longer. And all of that rebuilding requires real engineering, real imported materials, real financial resources. A country facing the level of sanctions Iran is under doesn't have those resources sitting around waiting for an emergency. You can't quickly bring in materials when your access to global markets is already choked off. You can't easily hire outside contractors when sanctions limit who's even allowed to work there. You can't take international loans when the banking system won't process the transaction. This is a completely different kind of pressure. It doesn't end a war in one dramatic strike. It grinds. It builds slowly, week after week, month after month. It's designed to work through time, not through a single knockout blow. If you're finding this useful, this is exactly the kind of story that only gets told properly with time and context, not in 30-second clips. Subscribing helps me keep doing that, and it means you'll see the next shift the moment it happens, instead of 3 days later buried under 100 other headlines. Now let's look at how this kind of pressure actually plays out inside a government, because it's far more complicated than people flipping a switch and suddenly giving up. When military sites get hit, the internal response tends to follow a familiar pattern. Rebuild, reinforce, keep going. There's usually a shared sense of purpose. We got hit, we respond, we hold the line. But when the target is a country's basic ability to function day to day, that internal conversation becomes far more fractured. Military leaders, want to keep projecting strength no matter the cost. Economic officials are watching supply chains collapse in real time and quietly asking how many more months this can realistically continue. Political leaders face the almost impossible task of explaining to an exhausted public why trains have stopped running, why blackouts keep happening, why prices are rising, all while trying to hold enough public support together to keep the country stable. That kind of internal strain, spread across months, is exactly the slow, grinding friction this kind of campaign is designed to create. The goal isn't destroying an army in one battle, it's creating enough internal pressure that a government starts pulling apart from competing directions on its own. There's also a regional dimension that doesn't get talked about enough. When a rail corridor connecting Iran to Central Asia gets damaged, it doesn't just affect Iran, it affects every country further down that trade route who depends on it too. It sends a clear signal to neighboring governments that staying closely tied to Iran right now carries real risk, no matter what those governments continue to say publicly for diplomatic reasons. The same thing happens with ports. Once a major port's control systems become unreliable, shipping companies and insurers start recalculating risk for the entire region, not just that one location. Ships reroute, businesses hedge, trade quietly shifts elsewhere. Those kinds of ripple effects can outlast the war itself, long after the missiles stop. There's also a diplomatic layer worth understanding. Iranian officials have consistently described their actions as defensive responses to what they call unprovoked American escalation. That's not unusual. Nearly every government at war frames itself as the side being forced to react. What actually matters isn't whether that narrative is believed internally. What matters is whether it still convinces the audiences it needs to reach, both at home and abroad. And when a country is visibly losing ground on its own infrastructure, the story of pure defensive victimhood becomes much harder to sustain. On the American side, officials have been unusually direct about which categories of targets remain on the table if things don't change, specifically naming power plants and bridges. That kind of blunt language isn't accidental. It's designed to remove any ambiguity about what continued escalation actually costs, and it puts the weight of the next decision squarely on the other side. There's also been a quiet shift among regional players who, earlier in this conflict, mostly issued cautious statements from a safe distance while privately hedging their bets. As the war has dragged on, some of those same countries have moved toward more direct forms of support, intelligence sharing, logistical help, quieter forms of coordination that rarely get formally announced, but that everyone in the region understands are happening. That shift matters, because when pressure is coming from multiple directions at once, it becomes much harder for the country under attack to frame the situation as one hostile actor acting alone against it. Isolation compounds, pressure multiplies. Let's talk about how these infrastructure campaigns actually get built, because most people imagine a general looking at a map and pointing at a bridge because it looks important. The real process is far more layered than that. Planners ask specific questions before ordering a strike. If this bridge goes down, how many other routes exist? How fast could traffic actually be rerouted? What industries or military operations genuinely depend on this exact corridor? How many civilians live near it compared to its actual strategic value? How long would repairs realistically take? That's an entirely different category of analysis than spotting a missile launcher sitting exposed in open terrain. It requires economic intelligence, supply chain knowledge, and understanding not just of where things are, but how they move and where the true choke points sit. This is also why modern infrastructure campaigns rely so heavily on long-range precision weapons instead of repeated close-range attacks. Cruise missiles, launched from aircraft, ships, or bombers, positioned well outside the range of remaining air defenses, let a single operation hit multiple targets in one coordinated sequence, without repeatedly sending pilots into contested airspace. Add satellite surveillance and real-time intelligence, and you get operations that take months to plan, but only hours to carry out. History gives us some useful perspective here, too. The idea of targeting a nation's infrastructure isn't new. Older wars used similar strategies, but with far less precision, wide-scale bombing that devastated entire power grids and transportation networks all at once. Those older campaigns often failed to change a government's behavior the way attackers hoped, because the damage didn't always connect directly to anything the leadership personally depended on. Modern precision targeting is meant to change that equation. In theory, today's weapons let planners hit exactly the systems tied to a regime's military and economic operations, while sparing enough of the civilian network to avoid total devastation, the kind that tends to backfire. Internationally, it can actually strengthen public support for the government under attack. That balance is incredibly difficult to hold. And based on the casualty reports coming out of Iran, that balance has clearly not held consistently. Bridges struck while people were crossing them, rail facilities hit during working hours. These aren't abstract points on a strategy map. They're direct consequences, experienced by people who had nothing to do with the decisions being made about them. So where does this leave the broader war? Iran has relied on a specific set of strategic pillars throughout this conflict. Control over the Strait of Hormuz, giving it leverage over global shipping. An alternate southern port with independent deep water access, working around pressure on the strait entirely. A northern rail corridor offering another route for sanctions evading trade. And enough military capacity to credibly threaten escalation if pushed too far. This latest wave of strikes goes directly after the second and third of those pillars. The port control systems got hit. The rail corridors feeding northern trade got hit. That's not random selection. That's a deliberate move against Iran's backup plans. And the explicit warnings about power plants represent a fourth kind of pressure entirely, aimed less at movement and more at whether the country can keep functioning as a modern state in the near term. Electricity fails. The economy tightens. Public patience wears thinner. There's also a financial dimension to all of this that rarely gets the attention it deserves. Every damaged bridge needs rebuilding. Every broken rail line needs restoring. Every power plant needs repair. That takes real money at a time when Iran's access to normal international financing is already choked by years of sanctions. Under normal circumstances, a country facing this level of damage would lean on foreign loans, outside contractors, and imported materials to rebuild quickly. Under the current sanctions regime, most of those paths are closed or heavily restricted. So whatever rebuilding does happen has to be financed and carried out with domestic resources that are already stretched thin by the cost of fighting a war on multiple fronts at once. That's the mechanism behind why this kind of pressure keeps working quietly long after individual headlines fade. It compounds. It accumulates. It presses against resources that don't have room to give, and it's worth remembering these effects don't vanish once a news cycle passes. A bridge that's struck doesn't disappear from the list of consequences the moment the next headline breaks. It often stays broken for months, sometimes longer, especially under the resource limits Iran is facing. A missile launcher can sometimes be replaced quickly if supply chains still exist. A bridge cannot be quickly replaced. Power infrastructure cannot be rapidly repaired. These are long recovery targets. They demand time, materials, and expertise that are all in short supply for a country under this level of economic strain. So here's the real question worth sitting with as this war continues. How much pressure can a government actually absorb before its decision-making genuinely shifts? Not the decisions it announces for public consumption, but the ones happening quietly in closed rooms where economic officials, military leaders, and political figures are all pulling in different directions because the ground underneath their entire country keeps moving. History suggests the answer usually isn't one dramatic turning point. It's accumulation. A slow, uncomfortable buildup of strain that eventually looks sudden from the outside, even though it was forming underneath for a long time. So what should you actually watch for going forward? If you want to understand where this is really heading instead of just reacting to whichever headline shows up first, watch how quickly damaged bridges and rail lines actually get repaired or whether they stay broken for months. Watch whether the tone coming out of Tehran shifts even slightly toward escalation or toward negotiation. Watch whether regional partners keep quietly pulling back or start easing toward business as usual. And watch whether real diplomatic movement happens, instead of the same public statements getting repeated over and over by both sides. This war has already moved through several distinct phases, but this latest one, aimed directly at the physical systems that keep an entire country functioning day to day, may end up mattering more than any phase before it. Not because a damaged bridge looks more dramatic than a missile strike, even though the human cost is often far more visible up close, but because this kind of pressure targets something much harder to replace than a weapon. It targets a government's basic ability to keep its country running, to keep trade moving, to keep the lights on, and to keep its people patient enough to endure whatever comes next. That is a fundamentally different kind of war than the one that started this whole chain of events. Whether this infrastructure campaign actually changes the outcome, or simply becomes one more phase that gets absorbed and managed like every phase before it, is something we'll only understand by watching closely in the months ahead, not by waiting for one clean, dramatic moment that wraps the whole story up neatly. Wars like this rarely end that way. They end slowly, in ways that are easy to miss if you're only watching the loudest headline. If there's one thing worth remembering after everything we've walked through today, it's this. The most dangerous strikes in a modern war aren't always the ones that make the biggest explosion on camera. Sometimes they're the quiet ones, the ones aimed at a bridge nobody paid attention to, a power line nobody thought twice about, a control tower most people didn't even know existed. Those are the strikes that decide whether a country can keep breathing long after the missiles stop flying. So think about that the next time a headline about this war flashes across your screen and doesn't mention a single explosion. That silence might be exactly where the real story is happening. If this gave you a clearer picture of what's actually unfolding, don't let it end here. Like this video so more people see the full story instead of the surface version. Subscribe so you're here for whatever comes next. And share this with someone who's only been getting the headlines. Tell me in the comments what you think happens from here. Does this pressure actually change the calculations inside Iran's government, or does it get absorbed like everything before it? I read these, and they genuinely shape what gets covered next. Thank you for watching all the way through, and I'll see you in the next one. Script data. What if the biggest danger in this war was never the missiles at all? What if the real damage started the moment a country's own bridges, its own power lines, its own ports began to fail? The full script is delivered above, covering the shift in U.S. targeting strategy against Iranian infrastructure, the humanitarian and legal tensions involved, the economic and sanctions, context, regional ripple effects, and what to watch for as the conflict evolves.